We're going to begin this morning with a question, and when I ask the question, I'm actually going to want you to reply, to actually say your answer out loud. And then I'm going to write your answer down on the board, and I'm going to put your answers together with the answers that I got from the 8:30 and the 9:30 service, and then I'm going to use some of what you say to shape our upcoming conversation. Here's the question. What would it take for Louisville to become an ideal city? Now, I realize that there's a lot of ways that we can answer that question. And so what I want to do is give you a filter through which I want you to do so. And that filter is Jesus the Christ. I want you to look at the city of Louisville and what it would take for Louisville to be ideal through the lens of Jesus. So, if Jesus were walking through our fair city and he was going through our neighborhoods, visiting our places of worship, our places of work, our schools, our various communities, if he was talking with people who lived in Louisville, what would he see that he would say, yes, that's it, that's ideal, I love that? What would he see that would break his heart and say, in order to be ideal, I need this to be fixed? That's the lens through which I want you to look as you begin to think about how you're going to answer this question. And I'm going to go ahead and get us started by writing up here something that I think this week has made fairly evident and obvious. Now, as I write down your answers, you're not going to be able to read what I write. I have a gift. Sometimes I can't read what I write. Also, apparently the spell check in this is broken. I don't know what's going on. So who knows what I'm going to write up here, but I'm going to do my best to capture what you are saying to me. And the first couple things that I want to write up here are this. I want to write no violence, and I want to write no hatred. And real quickly, I want to highlight that I did not write the words less violence and less hatred. I'll take less, but I want no. I want none. And I think if we look through the lens of Jesus Christ, he doesn't want less violence, less hatred. He wants no violence and no hatred in order for this city to be the ideal city that God may have in mind for us. What else? What else would help make our city ideal? Division to addition. I'm going to write down division to addition because we're probably going to go on to two columns here. Division to addition. Okay. Yeah. No addiction. That's what great minds. Well, what else? Compassion. You know, Louisville seeks to be a compassionate city. I think Jesus would think that's a good thing.
No homeless people.
No homeless. Okay?
No dividing line between neighbors sides of town.
Okay. Oh, that's how would we write that? Unified community. How about that? Unified community. Communities. Okay. Yeah. No hunger. Okay. What else? No mental illness. How about, because it feels big, I'm going to write no mental illness, and then I'm just going to add, health care. What's the word we're looking for here? A healthy community. I think God would want to see healthy community in whatever way that might be. Healthy community. Okay, what else? Yeah. Excuse me? No loneliness. No indifference. All right. Let's see some other, yeah. Okay, inclusion. That's kind of like, that's similar to that. I'm just going to write down inclusion. Yeah.
Clean, healthy air is as part of caring for God's creation.
Okay, can we add a clean air environment?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, what else? A couple more. I love this. I got room for 2 to 3 more. Education for all. That's a super important. Yeah.
No sin.
We got that up in the last service. You want to get it this time too? Last time he just said sin, and I had to ask him if he was for it or against it. No. And what we did last time too, which I'm going to do this time, is I'm going to say no/less sin, because we are going to sin, right? I mean, there's only one sinless person in this story, and it isn't me. I'm pretty sure it's none of you, though maybe you're hiding something from me. Any others for you? Yeah, Gene.
Opportunity to hear God's word.
Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm out of room. Hear God's word. Okay. All right. We're going to stop there. I know that you've got more, but I've run out of room. It's a pretty healthy list. It's a pretty good list. Now, I'm going to ask you another question, and the question is directly related to what you wrote on this list or what you're thinking about in your hearts and minds now. How can First Christian Church help make Louisville an ideal city? Here's something that I believe passionately and with my whole heart. God did not put the church on earth simply to be a place where people come and have their needs met. That is important. I am not denying that. We need to come here and have our needs met. Today is a perfect example of that. We need sanctuary, peace, and hope today. But God didn't design the church just to meet our needs. The church is designed to be the intersection between heaven and earth, and the church is designed to be God's presence on the earth, to make God's ideal known and experienced on this earth. We are a people with a mission. And if we lose sight of that mission, we've lost sight of our purpose, and we've lost sight of God's will for the church. I recognize that we are a church of about 350 people located in northeastern Jefferson County. And when we look at a list like this and we see how encompassing it is and how big it is, it can feel overwhelming to us. What can a little church do to make Louisville an ideal city in all of these areas of brokenness and hurt, and in those places where we have hope for healing and creating a more ideal community? It is a big, steep hill. It's a big ask. But the reality is, that's why we're here. If we lose sight of our call to make this community, even this world, more ideal and in the image of God, then we've lost our way. We're going to talk about that a little bit today, and what it can look like for our community of faith to be a community that is deeply devoted to making these things happen, to being a centerpiece for turning Louisville into the ideal city that God would want Louisville to be. And I want to start that conversation by going back a little bit in our history. Many of you may know that First Christian Church was formed in about 1834, so it's been around a while. In its early years, it grew it grew and separated and grew and formed different communities, but ultimately it landed together as a pretty solid faith community. And in 1877, First Christian Church made a big decision. They called Dr. Edward Powell as its senior minister. And we've talked about Dr. Powell before, but there's a reason that we talk about him so often. Dr. Powell probably impacted this community, and under his leadership, this community was changed probably more than any other leader who has been on staff or been a part of First Christian Church. Dr. Powell was one of these bigger-than-life leaders and very, very impactful in the city of Louisville. He wasn't just seen as a pastor of a church. He was in many ways seen as a pastor of a city. He was a large presence. People listened to him. He was out in the community. He sat on the city's vice committee, which sounds like a real hoot. He was really engaged in the civic life of the town. And at one point, he gave a speech to city leaders. And the purpose of his speech was to talk about how it is that Louisville needs to become an ideal city. And this is part of what he said. The ideal city is not some impossible dream. It does not belong to the land of the far away. It is the city that does the next thing to be done. The ideal is always the antithesis of the impossible. It is something which can and ought to be. Of course, this is always a flying goal. The ideal of tomorrow becomes the ideal of today becomes the actual of tomorrow. The ideal is the goal toward which we are pressing, the gleam which shines along our pathway. The ideal city has come only as manhood has come to the babe, when the babe is in the cradle, only as the day has come when the dawn begins to break on the hills. It will come, it is coming, it must come. Now, Dr. Powell, under this kind of idea, built a thriving church. People came to this church in very large number, and people came to this church who were very influential in our city. It was the classic big steeple church. At one point it was referred to as the church of millionaires because so many people of influence and power came to worship in our community. But Dr. Powell did not rest on his laurels by building a successful church where rich and powerful people came. What he did was he leveraged the resources that he had to make Louisville a more ideal city. And he did that in two ways. First thing he did was to build a very successful congregation that worshiped well, that studied well, that fellowshiped well, and took care of its members' needs very well. The second thing that he did was he leveraged the resources of that community of faith to impact the world beyond the church's doors. And there are so many examples of how the church has done this throughout its history. I want to share just one. It's a very concrete example. It was started by a group of young women in the church that saw a need. They formed a mission on East Jefferson Street, and the first purpose of that mission was simply to provide families with milk and basic health care. Milk and basic health care. So all these people started coming, and they were receiving just some milk and some basic health care, and the ministry grew and grew and grew until they outgrew the place where they were. So they bought some property, and they moved the ministry and mission over to the Portland neighborhood, and they began a community center there that would eventually be called the Rose Hudson Community Center. We have a picture of the property, and I don't know if this building has any ties to the original structure that dated back to the day, but we know this is the location of the property, and we know that First Christian Church sold the property to the Salvation Army, which then in time is going to create the Portland Boys and Girls Club. So this is all connected to First Christian Church and kind of the way it unfolded. The flood in 1937, when that flood came through and devastated the city of Louisville, First Christian Church and the Rose Hudson Community Center was at the heart of the recovery effort there. They led the recovery effort, or part of the leadership of the recovery effort in that part of town. So I love what Dr. Powell did and what the church did under his leadership. They were really focused on the two things that make a church: the worship of God and the education and training of disciples, and service to the world. And what Dr. Powell said is that you can't be, if you're going to be church, you have to be both of those things, both of them. You can provide the best worship service in the world with the best preaching in the world, the best band in the world, the best music in the world, the best donuts and coffee in the world. You can do all those things that make Sunday morning a great experience, but if that church isn't also doing everything it can to serve the world and change the world and make it a better place, it is not a church. If a church exists solely to make the world a better place, but it's not also about community and faith development and worship and all those things that come along with discipleship, it is not a church. You've got to both worship well and you've got to serve well in order to be the church that God has called us to be. And that fundamental principle has shaped the life of this church for generations. It is still who we are today. We worship passionately because we believe deeply in a God who loves us and a God who loves and cares for the world and all of humankind. And so we come here on Sundays and we worship and we sing and we share communion and we train disciples and we have studies and learning and all those kinds of things that make a church right here on site. And we are a church that's deeply committed to serving the world beyond our doors. All of this is a big part of who this church has always been and hopefully will always be. Now, I wrote this message and put this message together a little over a week ago. before the events of last week. And even as I had done so, I was looking at some of the things that I was writing down, and I made a list of my own. And like the list that we formed this morning, it felt a little bit overwhelming. And I looked at the list, I was like, God, really? I mean, that almost feels like it's impossible. I don't know how we're going to do that. And then again, to see what happened this week felt like even more of a setback, and created even a deeper sense of, it just sometimes feels hopeless. It feels hard. And honestly, I was kind of discouraged because I've got to go and encourage the church to be who God has called us to be. And right now, I'm kind of feeling, I'm feeling concerned about what's going on and if we can make this happen. And that's when Dr. Powell's words really started to kind of reach in and talk to me. It's like I'm sitting down with a colleague who's saying, here's what you need to say. And what I want to do is I want to go back to what he said, and I want us to sit with it for a minute, because that's what I've done. And as I've done that, it's kind of shaped me a little bit. And I want to start with how he started. The ideal city is not some impossible dream. It's not this thing that we cannot attain or achieve. The ideal city is something that he believed was a reality. It's something that he believed could happen. And it's something that he wanted to convince everyone who heard him speak was a possibility. I think often we think it's just really, really difficult to make these things happen, and because it feels so impossible, we're the ones who make it impossible. Dr. Powell doesn't want any part of that. He wants us to remember that as hard as it is still possible. If we're going to do God-sized work, it's going to be big, and it's going to be scary, and it's going to feel much larger than any one of us could ever do on our own, and that's precisely the point. We can only do it together, and we can only do it with the presence of God in our midst. If it's big enough that it can be done without those things, it's not big enough. It's not big enough. It's got to be bigger than any one person. It does not belong to the land of far away. The ideal city is something we start working on today, right now, in every way that we can. At First Christian Church, we ask everyone who walks through these doors to think about these things. What is it that you see in the world that breaks your heart? Where do you see brokenness and suffering? When you identify where you see brokenness and suffering in the church, the next question is, what are the tools and resources that God has given you that you can leverage to bring healing and hope into that situation? What are your gifts, your talents, your passions, your abilities? What has God given you so that you can go and make a difference in that place of brokenness? And if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? We are the ones who are being asked by God to do this work. And when God breaks our heart and gives us talents and passions, God's calling us to make a difference. It's not enough to wait for the other guy or gal. It's up to us. And it's not far away. It's today. It is a city that does the next thing to be done, and I love this because sometimes we feel overwhelmed by the task that is at hand, and it feels like we're never going to get there. Well, you just got to take one step at a time. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. The journey towards an ideal city begins with the healing of one broken heart. It begins with the filling of one empty belly. It begins with the ending of one addiction, the stopping of one heart that's filled with hatred or violence. Any one person that falls under any of these categories, we bring healing and hope to that one person. We have taken one step. That's the next thing to be done, and when that one's done, we go on to the next one. The ideal is always the antithesis of the impossible. I love that he wraps back to this because he knows what everybody's thinking. It's still too big. It is impossible. He says it's something which can and ought to be. And I love this. We live in a world, there's never been a time, there's really, can you think of a time in human history where there's no violence or no hatred? Right? This is just the standard. This is how we've learned to live. But what should be and what ought to be is a world without those things. The ideal city is the antithesis of the impossible. We don't let the impossible get in our way. We keep working for it and we never give up on it until we get as close as we possibly can. And then we keep trying to do more. Of course, it's always a flying goal. Like I said, I kind of put these thoughts together before we went on a little vacation last week, and look how much has changed in just 1 week. What we've been reminded of this week. Next week, something else is going to come up. This is always a changing goal. Life is different than it was in 1887. There are some same things that stayed the same, but there's a lot of difference there. The ideal of today can become the actual of tomorrow, right? So today it's just an idea. And I'm telling you, if you're a hungry person and someone has an idea to fill your belly and you go to sleep full, that's the actual today. It's real and it matters. The ideals can become actual when we make it so. The ideal is the goal toward which we are pressing, the gleam which shines along our pathway. The ideal city has come only as manhood has come when the babe is in the cradle, only as the day has come when the dawn begins to break on the hills. It will come, it is coming, it must come. What I love, man, that'll preach. What I love about it is that it can feel sometimes like we live in a world that is so dark that there is no hope, that we live in a world where there are so many things to be done that we will never fully get to the day when it is all taken care of. And yet, even in the midst of the darkness, even in the midst of the overwhelming things that are out there that are broken and breaking God's heart, the sun is coming up. If God has the ability to defeat death, don't you know that God has the ability to defeat these things? Anytime there is just the smallest fragment of light, it shatters the darkness. The ideal city will come when we work on it, small step at a time. It is coming, and in many ways we see it happening, but here's the thing, it must come. Church, it's got to come. Enough with this nonsense. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? We got to quit pointing fingers at everybody else. We got to look in the mirror. We got to figure out what's going on with us. We got to start chipping away. It's who God made us to be. It's why God put us here. You know, everybody looks up to God and says, God, why aren't you doing anything? And God looks down and says, I did something. I made you. I made the church. Why are you always looking up? Look out. Look out for one another and make a difference. You know, 10 years ago, our church adopted a new mission statement. At First Christian Church, we seek to be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world, welcoming all to the Lord's table just as God has welcomed us. Since that moment in time, this church has done two things that are helping to create an ideal city. The first is anyone who walks into these doors is welcome, without exception and without fail. No one is ever turned away. This is a sanctuary for all, end of story, period. The next thing that we've done is we've created an environment where we are reaching out and trying to make a difference into the brokenness of this world. Normally, this room is surrounded by pictures that tell that story. But today, those pictures are gone. Because just for a moment, I want you to imagine those stories not existing. Those pictures not being the tail of the tape, so to speak. And that we didn't have them in 2016. We didn't have them in 2015. That none of those things we've been doing over the past 3 years ever happened. The good news is that they did. And over the course of the next several weeks, we're going to fill this sanctuary up with ministries that have taken place in 2018. And what allowed those ministries to take place? You. Your time, your talents, and your treasures. You leverage what God gave you, and together as a church, we made a difference. In 3 weeks, we're going to come together once again, and we're going to start preparing for next year's ministries. And the way that we do that is we ask you to make a pledge to let us know what you're planning on giving in the coming year. And I know that right now you're thinking, oh, this whole thing was a money talk. You are right. It was. And I am not shy about that, and I am not apologetic about that, because in today's world, money talks. How do we get things done? It is human resources and it is material resources. And at the heart of those resources are financial resources. And if the church doesn't have them, then the walls stay empty. I don't know how else to say it. If the church doesn't have them, the walls stay empty. And so we as a church, what we do is we come together and we offer God our resources. And when we do that, we are able to do together what we could never, ever do alone. Next week, I'm gonna tell you some of the things that we've done over the last 3 years. And I think you know the story. You know some of it. It is unbelievable what God has unleashed through this congregation because of your generosity and what we've been doing together. It's unbelievable. You do not want to miss next week. And what you're going to find next week is that we might be more closer to this than you could have possibly imagined. I'm going to help you see that. It's really exciting stuff, and it gives me hope. But I want to close with a passage of Jesus, because I think a passage from Jesus, it's from the Sermon on the Mount, And I think this is what Jesus has in mind when Jesus is thinking about the church. First Christian Church, you are a light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. The church was never meant to be a place where we let the light of Christ shine only within these walls. We want it to shine bright in here. But we've got to let our light shine for all the world to see. Because in so doing, we let them know the way to the more ideal city, a city that is coming and a city that must come. I cannot wait to see what God has in store for us in the coming days. I cannot wait to get closer to that ideal city. I realize it's a flying goal. But friends, God has put us here at this time, in this place, to be the ones to help make it so. I'm glad to be part of the journey with you. I'm not sure I'd want to do it with anybody else. But together, I think we'll get a little bit closer to our goal. Amen.